Welcome to this Photoshop tutorial for digital scrapbookers. In this tutorial, I will show you how to lift the edges of a paper using the warp tool on shadows, create depth behind elements using two shadows at different distances, and create a fold or bend in the edges of strips of paper. Let's get started. For this shadow technique, I'm going to create a new Photoshop document. It's 12 inch by 12 inch, 300 pixels per inch, and it's transparent background. I'm going to pull in the two papers from the May downloads, the May Art Starts downloads. My diagonal paper is on the bottom and that mixed media paper is on top. With the mixed media paper selected, I'm going to hit Command T to transform it. And just so you are aware, you could go to Edit, scroll down to Transform, and Scale. I prefer to use quick keys. It's a lot faster. So I'm going to hit Command T. I want to lock my aspect ratio, my width and my height, so that I'm transforming the entire paper at the same time. Now I'm going to shrink it down by about an inch. So I'm making it around an 11-inch paper instead of the 12-inch paper. Next, I want to center that paper, that mixed media paper, on the diagonal paper. With both papers selected and making sure I'm on the Move tool, I'm going to go up to Align Horizontal Centers and, just to make sure, align vertical centers. Now that mixed media paper is perfectly aligned and centered on the diagonal. From here, with the mixed media paper selected, I'm going to go down to the Add a Layer style, click on that button, and select the drop shadow. Now Photoshop remembers the last settings I used, and I tend to keep shadows soft, and I tend to use linear burn and a dark gray color. I pull the color from the grayscale the grayscale swatches. I tend to use one of the dark charcoal grays, and the opacity's at 40. I have the distance at 30. It can be a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, but that is at a good distance. I keep the spread at 0. And that size is at 92. You can see how if I shrink the size down, it makes a harder edge. And if I increase the size, it makes that nice, soft, shallow shadow. And I'm keeping my contour on linear. Sometimes, but not often, I'll use a Gaussian blur on the shadow, but the Gaussian tends to be a harder, deeper shadow, so I prefer to keep it on linear. And now I have a nice, soft shadow on that paper so that it looks like it's lifted up off of the diagonal. Next, I want it to look as if just the edges of the paper are lifted. So I am going to put the drop shadow on its own separate layer. To do this, I'm going to right click directly over drop shadow, and I'm going to go down to create layer. Now the drop shadow, it's on its own separate layer, and I can transform and move that layer around on its own, separate from the paper. With the drop shadow selected, I'm going to transform it by hitting Command T. The first thing I want to do is cant it. So I'm going to go up to one of the corners, and I'm waiting for my cursor to change to the double arrows. And I'm going to put a slight cant on it. You can see I put it at about a 1.7 degree angle. Already, just doing that, it looks as if my edges are lifted further up off the paper. Now, I'm going to take that a step further by going back into the Transform tool. This time, I'm going to select the Warp And with this warp tool activated, I'm going to pull in my centers so that it looks as if that paper is sitting even closer to the diagonal, with my edges only raised. And because this shadow is on its own separate layer, I can also play with my fill-in opacity. I can make it look even softer or even darker. So this is one way you can have your top paper lifted up off of the bottom paper, making it look as if your edges only are raised up. Okay, I can also use this warped shadow technique with elements. It works well with journal strips, word art, and with other elements such as butterflies and moths. Okay, since I have my moth on top there, I'll start with that element. Okay, with my moth selected, I'm going to go down to the Add Layer Style, scroll down to Drop Shadows. Okay, and with this drop shadow, I want to make it look like these wings are lifted further off of the paper. So I'm going to increase my distance and I'm going to increase that size. And I'm going to make that nice and soft, a nice, soft, gentle shadow. And so as a reminder, I'm still on the linear contour for this. Okay. From here, I'm going to right click on Drop Shadow and create layer. Now that moth shadow is on its own separate layer. With the moth's drop shadows layer selected, once again hitting Command T for transform. With that transform tool pulled up, I'm going to go directly into warp. And with this in the warp mode, I'm going to bring in the centers. And I'm going to click up in this box where the wing is, and I'm going to bring that wing shadow down so that it looks like the wing is sitting further up off of the paper. And I'm going to do that to both the left and the right sides. Okay. Now from here, I'm going to, with the shadow still selected, I'm going to hit Command T once again. And I'm going to deselect the lock. I don't want the height and width to change at the same time. I'm going to deselect that, and just one side at a time, I'm going to bring that in a bit. This is warping these shadows. It becomes a matter of taste and your own individual artistry, what you want to do with these shadows. Okay, I'm going to bring that. I'm going to keep that down. Okay, I'm happy with this. I zoom out a bit. We can see, looks like the moth is sitting on the paper, but the tip of the wings are lifted further up off the paper than what the rest of the body is. And to carry on with this look, to make it more pronounced, I'm going to add a second shadow. So I'm going to click on my moth. I'm going to add a second drop shadow. Let me slide that over so you can see what I'm doing. And with this drop shadow, I want to make it more pronounced. So I'm shrinking the size so that I have a harder edge, and I'm making it closer to the paper by decreasing that distance. Okay. And from here, I'm going to erase portions of this shadow. So in order to do that, I'm going to click over on Drop Shadow, right click, and create layer. And once again, I've got a second drop shadow that's now on its own separate layer. And I want to erase away portions of the shadow, but instead of using the eraser tool, I'm going to put a mask on this drop shadow, clicking down on the layer mask. And then I'm going to hit the B for brush. I'm going to use a soft round brush. This is a general Photoshop brush. I've got my opacity 100%, my flow 100%, and just a 2% smoothing. With my brush on black and making sure I am selected on that mask layer, I'm going to erase away portions of that shadow. Because remember, I want the top of the wing to look like it's lifted up off of the paper, but the rest of this moth is sitting closer to the paper. I'm just erasing away the portions of that shadow that I don't want. And again, this is where your individual artistry and how far you want to carry these shadows, how much you want this to look like it's lifted off of the page, just becomes your own individual artistry. And it's a little bit dark for my taste, so I'm gonna, with that dark shadow selected, I'm just gonna lower its opacity a bit. All right, I'm happy with that. So now it looks like I have a moth sitting on a paper, but its tips of its wings are lifting off of the paper. And as I mentioned before, like with that mixed media paper, I want to keep all of these moth layers together. I'm going to select all three and I'm going to group them. And I'm going to name that moth. And now I can move these around together. Okay, for this label, I'm going to go down to the Add Layer Style, Drop Shadow. I can make that size a little bit softer. And double click on the drop shadow, right click on it, create layer. With the shadow selected, I'm going to hit Command T and go directly into warp. And I'm going to bring in that center. Okay. You can already see it looks like the edges are lifted up off the paper, and to help that effect, I'm going to hit Command T to transform it again. And I am not going to maintain the aspect ratio. I'm just going to move one side at a time. I'm going to bring those in. I'm going to bring the shadow, I'm going to squish the shadow in. So I think it gives even more of that effect where the edges are lifted, the label sitting on the paper, but the edges are curling up. And once again, we can make that look even more pronounced by giving a second drop shadow and making the edge of the shadow harder, more pronounced, and the distance closer. Right click, create layer. And once again, I can add a mask, use a soft round brush. It's on black and I'm on that mask. I can erase away portions of that shadow. And because that shadow is on its own layer, I can also move it up or down. So I got just that little bit that's darker, and to me it starts to mimic what shadows actually do. Something that is sitting close to a paper is going to have a dark, harder shadow, and things that are lifted up, it's more soft, more fuzzy type borders. So you can also make it look as if your label just the edges are coming up off of the paper. The next thing I want to show you is using the burn and dodge tool. Using this tool can make it look as if your edges of your word art or your papers, it can make it look like it's folded up or crinkled up. First thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new layer. I'm just going to hit Command J to duplicate that label, and then I'm going to turn off what I've already done. Okay, on that new label, I am going to create a new drop shadow, a nice soft drop shadow. And I'm going to come over to the burn tool. This burn tool looks like the little hand, and it's in the same area as the dodge tool and the sponge tool. Now the burn tool is going to add a shadow. It's going to burn your element. The dodge tool is going to lighten it up. It's going to make it look like there's a highlight. And the sponge tool, I rarely use the sponge tool. It changes the saturation, adds like a grayscale to your elements. But today we're going to use the burn tool and possibly the dodge tool, but for sure the burn tool. With the burn tool selected, I'm using a general Photoshop brush, the soft round brush. I have the hardness set to 30%. I usually don't start with a softer brush or a harder brush. I usually start with 30. 30 and 30 are what I like to start with. I'm on the highlights, and the exposure is set to 30%. That's how much we're going to burn it. This label is currently a smart object. So the first thing I have to do is right click it and rasterize layer. So now I can directly edit these pixels. With that burn tool selected, I'm going to go over this label. I'm doing it on the top edge to make it look like the light is coming down, it's producing a shadow here, and this piece of paper is curled or furled up along this top edge. So first I did the highlights, and now I'm going to repeat that on the midtones. Now I'm getting that darker look. Now with this magenta purplish color, I probably don't want to burn the shadows. Okay, when I do that, for me it's changing the saturation, and that's not what I'm wanting to do. I don't want to rub that color up. Instead I want to produce shadows. Using burn and dodge tool, it's a very subjective, and oftentimes I have to do and redo, keep playing with my settings. Oftentimes I'll lower exposure and I'll make a softer brush. Sometimes I'll make a harder brush. Since I don't like that effect on the shadows, I'm just going to hit Command Z to undo what I had just done. But you can see using this burn tool on this label, on the highlights and the midtones, it creates this shadow effect to make it look like there's a bend or fold in this label. And I wanted to show you this on a different color label. Let me go back and add a shadow. And once again, I'm going to use that burn tool. And I have to rasterize that layer in order to directly modify the pixels. I'm using that soft round brush. I'm going to start with the hardness of 30 and 30. And this time I'm going to go to highlights. And once again, it's going to go over that brush. This time I'm just going to clip this edge. So it's going to look like just one edge is furled up. And select midtones, repeat that process. And this time I can probably go as far as the shadows. Burning this lighter color has a different effect than burning like this magenta purplish color. Okay, so now you can see that using that burn tool, I've created this shadow along the edge to make it look like these papers are folded. Now, sometimes from here, it's harder to do it on this magenta purplish label, but on this lighter color one, I can also use a Dodge tool. And with this Dodge tool, I'm going to create a highlight on this label. Again, I'm going to use a soft brush. I'm going to decrease my hardness just a bit. I'm going to drop that down to 5%. I'm going to work on the highlights, and it's really easy to overdo this effect. So I'm going to start with just an exposure of 3. I'm going to increase my brush size a bit. And I'm just going to start applying some of that highlight there. Okay, you see when I zoom out how it's looking like a shot, like the light, coming from the top, that 90-degree angle, it's hitting the edge of this label. This label's folded over, so I'm getting a shadow. And then here it's like it's bumped up on itself. So the light is hitting here and creating this highlight. And I can make this look like there's even more depth by going back to the burn tool. I'm going to start again with my highlights. I'm just going to make sure I'm on that 30%. I'm going to decrease that. I want this shadow I'm going to create now to be a little bit softer. Okay. And with that pressed, I'm going to come down on this edge. Start with the highlights and then take it to the midtones. All right. And now you can see that by burning and dodging this label, it's like I'm crinkling it up. I'm creating all these folds, all these nooks and crannies where the light is hitting it. And this is one of the ways you can create the illusion of depth and texture in your layouts. So burn and dodge is destructive. I am directly manipulating these pixels. Before I move on, I want to show you burn and dodge on this lighter color label again. I've showed you how we can create this effect where like the light is coming down, it's hitting this edge. There's a fold in this label, so there's a shadow on this top portion. And then there's a fold on this bottom portion. So I can use that dodge tool to create that highlight going across, and the burn tool to create this shadow on the bottom, creating lots of depth and texture in that label. I'm going to repeat that effect, but this time on the edges of the label. So if I want to create the same exact shadow that's there, I can click on the shadow, use my Option key, and drag that shadow up. So I've made a clone of that shadow, and I don't have to go through the add layer effect. Okay. On this new label, again, I have to rasterize the layer because I'm going to be manipulating the pixels directly. I'm going to go back to my burn tool, the little hand. I'm going to use that soft round brush. I do want some hardness, maybe at about a 10%, and I'll stick with the exposure at 30. A nice soft round brush. I'm going to make it look like that edge is bent over. Okay, I'm going to do it there. It was a little bit too much. So I'm going to hit Command Z. I like it there better. Also made the mistake in that I'm starting with midtones. I prefer to start with highlights and then work my way into the midtones. Now I'm getting that nice shadow effect. Okay, and I'm going to come over to this other side, do the same thing. Do want to get a bit of the midtones. There we go. And with this lighter color, I can also do the streak of the shadows, make the actual darker areas look darker. Okay. Now it's looking like these edges are folding over. Now I'm going to go to the dodge tool. Soft round brush. Let's start with that hardness of 5, exposure at 3. I don't want this too much. It's so easy to overdo this effect. I'm going to make that area of highlight so that it really looks like that paper is folded up and crinkled. Okay, and so when I zoom out, you can see how it makes it look like the edges are folded over. And this concludes my tutorial on shadows for digital scrapbookers. As a recap, today I showed you how to lift the edges of your papers by using the warp tool on a shadow. I showed you how to create depth on elements by using shadows at 2 different distances. And I showed you how to use the burn and dodge tools on elements such as paper strips, which can cause them to have a crinkled, wrinkled look. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing your creations over at Digital Artistry.